All right, hello everyone. Welcome to Frank Analysis. I am your host Franco, and I am delighted to be joined by Eva Bartlett, who is an American Canadian international journalist who's done a lot of great work on the ground. Thank you, Eva. I'm so glad you're finally on the show. I
Yeah.
know that your life is in danger right now with you being on a Ukraine kill list. So, how is everything, and what exactly is this kill list?
I'll just begin, Franco, first by saying thanks for having me on. But I want to emphasize, more importantly than my name being on this kill list, along with thousands of other people, that the lives of the people of the Donbass republics are at risk. Ukraine has unleashed hell the last couple of days. After having done so on June 13th. But yesterday was particularly bad, and they've also continued shelling today. And, there are people on the streets. I was just out quickly buying some water and I saw elderly on the streets selling flowers still. And my heart broke thinking, like, they're so accustomed to the shelling that they're just going to go about their daily routine and try to earn a living. They're not sheltering somewhere. And Ukraine was shelling central Donetsk, where I am right now, heavily yesterday. Last I've seen, the death toll was 7 and over 20 injured, although I suspect that over 20 injured is an underestimate, and something like 400 shells. And then, on June 13th, it was, uh, I'd have to look at my notes, but it was like, yeah, 300 long range rockets and artillery shells, and six people killed on June 13th, and hospitals shelled, including a maternity hospital, civilian infrastructure, and in fact, zero military targets shelled. Ukraine is terrorizing the people here. And there's really nowhere safe. I mean, people can hide in stairwells or in their basements, and maybe they'll survive. But Ukraine has some pretty powerful stuff, and is trying to maximize civilian damage. So I just feel like I should emphasize that
Mm-hmm.
right now everybody's lives here, particularly the poorest people, are at risk.
Yeah, and the CBC, Canadian Broadcasting. I'm sorry, what does it stand for? It's not
Uh,
reporting on it, and it's not because you're a
no.
Canadian journalist, and they're supposed to be looking out for you, reporting it to its citizens, but they're not doing that, and neither is Justin Trudeau or anybody from Canada really talking about this.
No, and so yesterday I actually went to Gorlivka. I did not anticipating that Ukraine was going to heavily bomb Donetsk, or else I would have stayed here. But Gorlivka was also sorry. Gorlivka is to the north of Donetsk. It was also being shelled, but not heavy, not as heavy as this. I mean, it was frequent, but more on the outskirts. Whereas Donetsk, as I said a moment ago, it was all over and very central Donetsk. But I noticed a tweet. I forget who the tweet was from, but saying, "Yeah, the UN mentioned the shelling of Donetsk." But when it spoke of shelling of Kiev, it mentioned Russia 300 times. And how many times did it mention Kiev when it mentioned the shelling of Donetsk? Zero. So I can find, actually, I have that open here. Let me just find the sources for that.
Okay.
Um, it's not actually going to give me the source, but anyway, the point being made, that's how the UN and media operate. I can think of many examples regarding the UN downplaying the terrorism of terrorists who were then in eastern Ghouta, constantly mortaring civilian areas of Damascus, and then UN not reporting it at all, for example. And as for media, yeah, it's not surprising that they're not reporting on it. So you and your listeners may be aware that back in March, media in lockstep were reporting that Russia had airstruck a maternity hospital in Mariupol and killed three
Yeah.
civilians, right? And there was a lot of condemnation, including from the UN, which called it horrific. The Secretary General called it horrific. And it turned out that actually that story was manufactured, that according to numerous witnesses that saw or were there at the time, there was no airstrike, there were no airplanes at the time overhead. And also just according to, people who can do forensic examinations on bomb sites, it was not an airstrike. And the other factor being that in late February, Azov and other Ukrainian militants had forced staff and patients out of this particular hospital. So the story didn't jive, but Western corporate media didn't go back and correct it, or if they did, it would be in extremely small print. And yet that went on for weeks with the media accusing Russia of having airstruck a hospital. And I bring this up because now, as I mentioned on June 13th, when Ukraine shelled the city heavily, Donetsk and around the Donbass, it did strike a maternity hospital with a Yurikon missile going through the roof of the maternity hospital. Thankfully, no one was killed because they were sheltering in the basement because shelling was going on all day. But point being, if they hadn't sheltered in the basement, if they had been in normal wards of the maternity hospital, they would have been killed or injured. And not only did media not say anything about this, but again, some media said it was Russian shelling of the city. Just absolutely disgusting and dishonest. So I'm not surprised by CBC.
Yeah, and they're also not reporting how Russia was providing humanitarian aid. So when you were in a town called Shastia in the Donbass region, you were there for 2 days. You got to speak with some of the people there. So what did you see while you were there in addition to this, humanitarian aid that was being provided by Russia?
Yeah, so that was in March, and at that time I had joined a delegation of journalists, and that was a 2-day delegation in the Donbass, so including both the Donetsk People's Republic and the Lugansk People's Republic. This town that you're mentioning, sorry, is in the Lugansk People's Republic,
Okay.
Shastia, and yeah, I saw humanitarian aid being delivered in a very orderly fashion. Russian humanitarian aid, I should note, and there was a lot of destruction. But again, with everywhere, including Mariupol, when you want to talk about destruction, you have to acknowledge that if Ukraine had not militarized civilian infrastructure, including hospitals and schools, and fired from there and kept civilians as human shield, the destruction would be far less. And again, another thing worth mentioning is, of course, when we talk about America's wars of aggressions against sovereign nations, whether it's Iraq or Libya, former Yugoslavia, or Saudi's ongoing genocide in Yemen, or Israel's relentless, continual, every so often sporadic bombardments of Gaza, they don't take into account civilians. In fact, they do their utmost to maximize murder of civilians and destruction of infrastructure. And that's not what Russia has been doing. So just back to the point about, like, yes, there is destruction, but now there are countless testimonies taken not only by Russian and Donbass media, but by foreign journalists here as well, whether it's like Patrick Lancaster or foreign journalists that come here briefly on a media delegation and take testimonies. There are countless testimonies. And also Maxim Grigoriev, he's an excellent Russian researcher that's been diligently taking testimonies throughout the Donbass, but particularly in Mariupol. There are so many testimonies of people saying the Ukrainian forces, whether they were the army or the Azov or IDAR battalions, held us as human shields, and they wouldn't let us leave. And they occupied the top floors of our apartment buildings, and they fired on the Russian or Donbass forces from there. So that's the context that is always missing from conversations about destruction. And actually, if I may, on that same delegation, we also went to the town of Volnovakha, which got a lot of play in media, not as much as Mariupol, but the hospital there was badly damaged, destroyed. And again, the context that was missing was that Ukraine had occupied that hospital, militarized it, and mined the ICU before leaving. And that was all information given to us by the chief physician of that hospital. And as I made a point after this March delegation, the two mainstream French channels that were with us and heard the exact same things that I heard neglected to include in their report this chief physician's words. So the implication was this was all Russia. And they didn't even mention, to be honest, they didn't even mention Ukraine's 8 years of war in the Donbass. They didn't mention the site of the Tuchka-U bombing in March 14th that we had gone to in Donetsk, just a couple streets over from where I am, actually, which killed, I believe it was 21 people. Tuchka-U, this particular missile was filled with cluster munitions. So many levels of criminality, right? Targeting a heavily populated civilian area, a busy street during a busy time of day with cluster munitions. And they didn't even mention that. So um, even like one thing people will say is, well, they're not there, they can't get access, so how could they possibly report honestly? Well, even when they do have access, they've come here with a predetermined narrative, and they omit critical information.
And when you were on the ground, you also got to speak with Roman Kosarev. Right?
Yeah.
He's been there in the Donbass republics for the past 8 years, and he's told several devastating stories of ethnically Russian people being killed by the Ukrainian military. So, what can you tell us about some of these conversations that you've had with Roman Kasparov?
Yeah, well, as you rightly noted, he has been for the duration of Ukraine's war on the Donbass, and he himself has come under shelling. He's been injured on many occasions. He's a very courageous but humble guy, and he really cares for the people here. He's not he definitely takes risks in that he goes to places where it's very dangerous for him to go to, but his focus is usually, if I can say this and not paraphrase or misparaphrase him, his focus is usually on the human side, on really showing the human suffering. And also, he's done, I have to say, I have to toot his horn, he's done a lot of remarkable humanitarian work in collecting money from people in Russia primarily, and because there's a lot of empathy in Russia for the people of the Donbass and for Ukraine itself, by the way, contrary to how Western media would be depicting Russians. He's collected like $35,000 worth of humanitarian aid and taken it to areas where people are desperately in need. So I would say, he's seen a lot of traumatic events in the 8 years of his coverage. He's obviously seen people killed in front of him. You couldn't not see that if you're reporting from here that long. But he's also done a lot to really help people here. And uh, I've been working with him on this recent trip here, and so we went to the maternity hospital and also a marketplace that was struck on June 13th, and he's been a huge help to me since I do lack the language skills, so I have to also give him, credit for helping fellow journalists to do the reporting that I'm here to do. But yeah, he's a very courageous journalist, and he is an English language journalist too. So that's one thing people could benefit from. Those of us who don't speak Russian, he's trilingual, and he's doing the reporting in English.
So it's because of this reporting that you've been doing, and you've been to the Donetsk People's Republic in 2019.
Yeah.
So it's because of this reporting that you've been doing since this time that you ended up on this kill list.
Oh yeah, so back to that. Yeah, I believe it was a combination of factors, because you don't have to be a journalist to end up on the kill list. You could, and I also want to emphasize that among the thousands and thousands of names on that list are Ukrainians, whether they're journalists, opposition members, activists, or just normal civilians that have in some way offended the state and are deemed a danger to the state or treason or what have you, including like a taxi driver who's driven the wrong person. It's pretty ridiculous and absurd. The other thing I want to clarify or add is that it's known as a kill list by those who are aware of it, because they put so much information on there and call for people who are listed to be liquidated. So you can hardly draw any other inference than that it is a kill list. And added to that, many people who've been put on there have been killed or disappeared after having their names put on there. But I was made aware of it by a colleague, I think in 2019, maybe 2020, I forget. And I imagine that my initial crimes were having gone to Crimea and asked people there, like, were you forced to join Russia, as the West claimed, or what's the story? And people I met there, again, through the help of a translator, said, no, we were demanding to hold a referendum. We wanted to join Russia. We wanted to return to Russia, was the language they were using. So that might have been one of my offenses. And then otherwise, as you mentioned, coming to the Donbass in September 2019, I came here for about 3 weeks on my own. I wrote a long article after that for Mint Press News. But yeah, I went to some areas north of Donetsk that were particularly hard hit by Ukrainian shelling. And, the people there told me that the body that's supposed to monitor violations of the ceasefire, the peace agreement, the Minsk Treaty, whatever, the OSCE, they said, like, yeah, well, once they leave at night, then the shelling gets really bad. This was in 2019, the areas I visited outside of Gorlivka. And like, just house after house was either completely destroyed or so badly damaged it was barely inhabitable. And that we were nearing winter, and I remember meeting this older lady who could be all of our grandmother, and she was just like living alone and wondering how she was going to survive the winter, on her pension and with her house badly damaged. And it gets pretty cold here. And it was just, it might seem like a little thing, but it's not a little thing. And in addition to that, she's being terrorized every single night. And I asked her, "Are you afraid?" She said, "Of course. Why do you stay? Where would I go?" And that was the common answer I would get when asking the stupid question, "Why do you stay? Where would I go? Where could I go?" Other people wouldn't want to leave, just like Palestinians and other people being oppressed by entities like Israel don't want to leave because it's their home, it's their land. Why should they leave, right? But
Right.
others just don't simply have the option. So it could have been for that reason that I was put on the list. But the interesting thing about that my entry is it's been updated since. And so it now the primary focus is the fact that I participated in a capacity of a journalist on a tribunal held in Moscow to discuss Ukraine's war crimes. And so my updated entry on the list has that offense on it. But what's even more interesting about that is that so the CBC, which you referred to earlier, did reach out to me, but not to express concern that I'm on that list, but rather to say, "We want to talk to you about your participation in this tribunal." And in my opinion, the only way they knew about that tribunal was that they knew my name was on the list. So that just shows their depravity, that they don't care about a fellow Canadian. They're not concerned at all about just imagine if this was a Russian kill list,
Right.
right? Then I'd be flooded with phone calls and people want to give me so much airtime. But because it's our ally, Ukraine, who Canada has funded at least to $1 billion, or is it more? Because it's our ally, yeah, they're not going to say anything. And CBC are shameless propagandists. In 2009, I was living in Gaza when Israel was warring on Gaza. If you remember, it started on December 27th, 2008, and continued on for a few weeks. And at some point, CBC called me and said, "We're thinking about interviewing you next week." And I was like, it was the first time I'd been in a war, and there was like talk about literally nowhere to hide. Gaza is such a tiny place. There was nowhere to hide. Nothing was safe, including UN shelters. And I was like, why next week? Why not right now? And the reason why next week was that they wanted to have a balanced interview. They couldn't just interview me and the fact that we were like, I was riding with ambulances, so really seeing a lot of horrible things. They wanted to have a Canadian in Israel so they could have a nice balanced interview, which actually backfired on them because their Canadian in Israel wasn't experiencing even a fraction of what I was experiencing in Gaza. But that just, I'm sure you could speak at length about the nature of corporate owned media, but I mean that's just one illustration.
Yeah, yeah, it's not nonstop hypocrisy here. Similarly to how also Australia won't do anything to protect its journalists, like Julian Assange, but that's because he exposed Western empires, and that's what people like you and other journalists are doing is exposing Western empires. But yeah, if you were Russian, if you were on a Russian kill list,
Yeah,
the media would be nonstop talking about it,
absolutely.
and
Absolutely.
in addition to that, we have other political hypocrites like Justin Trudeau who tweeted this out. He said Putin's decision to expel Canadian media from Moscow is an attempt to silence them from reporting the facts, and it is unacceptable. Journalists
Right.
must be able to work safely, free from censorship, intimidation, and
Hmm.
interference. That is something Canada will always stand up for. Meanwhile, he's not saying anything about what happened to you. He's not saying
Right.
anything about the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh,
Right.
who was killed by Israelis, and she's a Palestinian journalist, or about the torture of Julian Assange or other journalists who are, political prisoners. So,
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on, what Justin Trudeau said? And also, wasn't Putin's decision here in response to how
Yes.
Canada banned RT from being broadcasted in Canada?
Yeah, exactly. Thank you for pointing that out because Canadian media, CBC in particular, has operated, sorry, freely in Russia for years and years until recently, until this like tit for tat response to how Canada had banned Russian media. But Canada has been banning Russian media for years. I remember writing an article. Oh gosh, it was either 2020 or 2021, and it was about a media freedom conference held in the UK. Canada participated, and they had like all the main players when it came to war propagandists. Al Jazeera, CBC, I think Channel 4 News, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, RT was not allowed to participate. They came up with some flimsy reason, like, they had applied for accreditation too late or something like that. It was clearly nonsense. But I remember when I was writing about that, I came across whenever it was that Canada and the Lima Group met in Canada. RT and also Latin American media were not allowed to participate. So, Canada has a history of hypocrisy when it comes to media censorship. But yeah, your point, like, okay, Justin Trudeau probably has no idea who I am. I don't really care about that. But I'm sure that we're somebody to reach him and say, hey, Canadians on a kill list. I'm sure he would not have my back at all. And there was one other point I was going to make, and that is, again, within their supposedly democratic ally, Ukraine, I don't even know the number of journalists that have been imprisoned and tortured. I know I was advocating for one of them, Kirill Vyshinsky. He was the head of RIA Novosti, chief editor of RIA Novosti, until his arrest in 2018. And he was held for over a year, on, I think it was like 400 days, on ridiculous charges of having committed state treason back 4 years prior in 2014. So he's arrested 4 years after his alleged offense. And his crime, get this, as an editor, was publishing 14 or 15 editorials or op-eds that weren't even written by him and that contained opposing views as to what was happening in Ukraine in 2014. So he didn't even write the articles, and there would have been the standard disclaimer at the bottom that these views do not reflect necessarily the opinions of the editor. And nonetheless, he was imprisoned and tortured and kept in terrible conditions. And he's not the only journalist that's been in prison. So for Justin Trudeau to speak about, freedom from censorship and journalistic freedom, it's just completely empty words, And Zelensky himself is aware of this kill list. And he himself said something like, he didn't want to interfere with the website and have it taken down, something like that, because that would be interfering with freedom of the press. When in fact, this list is, its existence is to interfere with freedom of the press and freedom of expression.
Right. It sounds tyrannical here. While they're trying to control the narrative by any means necessary, even if it is at the expense of the safety of journalists like yourself. And I want to bring up Chrystia Freeland here, who's the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, and who was pushing recently for freezing the bank accounts of anybody who's suspected of supporting the truckers' protest that was happening a couple of months ago in Canada, as when they were opposing the vaccine mandates. Apparently, she was also an editor-in-chief of Reuters and Financial Times and other publications, but then she gets to work in the Canadian government. So there seems to be like some kind of intertwined connection here between these governments and these corporate media outlets. But also, her grandfather was a Nazi collaborator.
Yeah.
And I think there's some, isn't there some footage of her saying like "Slava Ukraine" or something like that? But what can you speak to that?
There's like I know I've seen it on Twitter. I think it was photos. It might be also stills from a video. I'm not 100% sure about that, but definitely of her holding a flag. I think it was a black and red flag, and definitely saying Slava Ukraine. But of course, they would argue that just means glory to Ukraine or something. But we all know that usually that's a phrase that is uttered by these Ukrainian nationalists, including those who have Nazi sentiments or open Nazi ideologies. And she was holding this, I think it was red and black flag that also represents this Nazi ideology. So yeah, there's that. And when it came out that her grandfather, I think his name was Michael Chomiak, anyway, last name was Chomiak, was a Nazi collaborator, they first... the Canadian government first tried to say, oh, this is Russian disinformation, because the person that I believe was kind of instrumental in leaking this to the Ottawa Citizen was a Russian diplomat, and he was kicked out of Canada, and they tried to spin the story, oh, this is just Russian disinformation. But it turns out the initial researchers were based in Alberta, and they have a whole trove of information on Freeland and the grandfather and her activities in Ukraine and her activities with these nationalist-minded Ukrainians in diaspora in Canada. So it's more information than I have time to fully digest and memorize, but it's a wealth of information, and she's definitely not a squeaky clean character. She's the complete opposite. And she's probably one of the primary reasons of our funding and training to not only to Ukrainian army, but also nationalists. Like I have in my bookmarks some article, probably by the Ottawa Citizen again. I think the author was David Puglia's. And it talks about how like Canadian security forces met with Ukrainian Nazi groups, and the fact that they met with them wasn't the problem. The problem was the fact that they were worried that their meeting would get out to the media. So it's like Canada is not unaware of Ukraine's Nazi problem, because Canada has one as well. But they just like now in February 2022, suddenly Western media stops talking about the Nazis in Ukraine and starts pretending, no, these are all just heroic Ukrainian defenders. And even I think it was the BBC went as far as kind of like out of video footage, like photoshopping the Nazi emblems on some soldiers that were in their footage. So, I mean, this is like back to Freeland in Canada. They have been open in their support to these extremist Nazi elements. And she's one of the reasons why I say Canada would not have my back. I don't believe, I think Trudeau is just a face, just a talking head, but Freeland has some serious power and some serious extremist ideas. And that's why I was saying in a previous interview, like, were I to go back to Canada and any of these people that have these Nazi ideologies or extremist ideologies to see me and decide to act upon like their perceived notion that I'm somehow a threat to Ukraine or I've committed some sort of crime, I don't believe Canada would protect me. I'm not sitting here quaking in fear at the thought of it, but I'm just saying, like, it's a fact. I probably wouldn't have the protection of my government. And actually, if I can just go on a tangent on an aside, one reason I feel that, aside from the fact that I know their affiliation with Nazis in Ukraine, but in 2010, I think it was, when I was living in Gaza, one of the things I was doing there was accompanying farmers as they tried to go on their land and came under intense live fire by Israeli soldiers. And at one point, I was an activist with the ISM, the International Solidarity Movement at that time. And at one point, one of the volunteers in the media office contacted there were like 5 or 6 of us internationals, and they contacted our representative embassies. And so a woman named Heather from the Canadian Embassy in Tel Aviv contacted me and asked me a bunch of questions about where I was and why that I was under fire and how long it had been. I'm like, it's been 40 minutes, et cetera, et cetera. And she finally realized I wasn't being fired at by Palestinians. That was her assumption. And then she said, well, how do you know it's Israelis? And I said, because I saw the Jeep pull up and I saw them get out and fire at us. And they always do this. And then she just said, we can't help you. And then her superior called me back some minutes later, and he just said, you should understand Israel's security measures, something like that. And I just said, like, dude, I'm not even in the 300 meters on the Gaza side no-go zone that is imposed unilaterally by Israel, and I would say also illegally. We were 500 meters or more from that fence. So we were outside of what Israel calls the no-go zone, and they were still firing on us. And we were, Israel has systematically destroyed the farmland and the region in that border, that eastern region used to be plentiful of trees, I'm told. I don't see them now because they've all been bulldozed and destroyed. So with the naked eye, the Israeli soldiers know what they're shooting at, and they could see they're shooting at unarmed Palestinian farmers and us. But I told this Geordie of the Canadian Embassy, I said, this is what's going on. You're okay with this? And he's like, Israel's security measures. So that's again why I say Canada would not have my back. And look at America. Look at Rachel Corrie, bulldozed by Israel. And did America have Rachel Corrie's family's backs? Did they do anything at all to investigate or to hold Israel accountable? No. And she was like, I said that in passing, she was bulldozed to death by an Israeli bulldozer in the early 2000s.
That just reveals the massive hypocrisy. Like they just switch the script when they find out, oh, it's not Palestinians, oh, it's Israelis, oh, okay, never mind. You should know better. You should know better that they have security measures. You should be more careful out there. Then they put the blame on you for being shot at. But yeah, going back to Chrystia Freeland here, though, I mean, I think it's ironic that this is someone who was claiming to be standing against these nationalists or right wingers that were at the Canadian
Oh,
truckers
right.
protest, and she gets praised as this LGBTQ rights Yas queen hero for liberals. Meanwhile, she is a descendant of Nazis and helping to fund the Azov Battalion
Yeah.
in Ukraine. But the whole purpose of why Putin wanted to go into this region is because he wanted to rid the region from these nationalists, these Nazis. And I saw that you cited this international criminal lawyer, uh, Christopher Black, on the legality of war. So just for the audience out there, I just want to know what exactly it is that he was saying here, and I know you're not an international lawyer, but just to give some of your views on what you agree with Christopher Black said here.
Oh gosh, now I shared that article. That would have been
Yeah.
probably in late February. So I don't remember all the details of the article at this point. But I think basically, it, but he's not the only one who's said this. Other people, with Dan Kovalik has a legal background. He's also argued this, Daniel Kovalik, and I've seen it from one other source that has a legal background. But anyway, I think the point was basically. I can't remember all the international law clauses that could be cited, but Russia had credible intelligence that Ukraine was prepared to mount an offensive on the Donbass, and acted before that happened. And actually, uh, Putin gave Ukraine a chance to retreat and not act on that, and they pushed further eastwards. This is before the military operation in Ukraine began. But yeah, as for all the details in that article, I'm really sorry, but I don't remember them.
Hmm.
But the other points being that the context in general that people have missed, because the media, of course, hasn't given it to them, is not only Ukraine's 8 years of war on the Donbass and violations of the Minsk Accords, using heavy weapons that are prohibited and targeting civilian infrastructure over the course of these 8 years repeatedly, but also NATO's continued expansion eastward. And I'm pretty sure Christopher Black would have mentioned it in that article. And if he didn't, there's another excellent article by Jacques Baud in The Postal. The Postal wasn't the original publication, but it's been translated from, I believe it was in French initially. He's a Swiss former intelligence officer, and he wrote about this. And he also argued, again, Russia had credible intelligence that Ukraine was prepared to mount an offensive against the Donbass, that the people of the Donbass had explicitly asked, they are ethnic Russians and Russian speakers, and they explicitly asked for Russia's help and assistance to avoid a genocide. Even though a lot of people would argue what's been happening here in the past 8 years has been a slow genocide. Of course, Western leadership laughs and scoffs and derides that notion because they're sociopaths. But yeah, maybe I mean, if you even want to remind me of some of the key points that Christopher Black outlined in that article, that would be great because, as I said, it's been a few months.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much saying that it's in self defense that ethnically Russian people are being killed by the Ukrainian military. And let me find here one part of the article where he says, "We remember in the past few months, the NATO nations have conducted military exercises that included practicing launching nuclear attacks on Russia. We also remember that the USA has a first strike nuclear war policy, claiming the right to use nuclear weapons wherever and whenever they deem fit. It was evident that they were practicing attacks because that was and is their intention." Uh, so pretty much it's a self defense, and it's hypocritical of the U.S. to be criticizing Russia for responding in this way, when the U.S. would have done the same thing.
Absolutely, without even as much of a reason to do so. I don't know if you can see it. I just posted the link to the article by this Swiss
Yeah,
intelligence
yeah.
guy. Yeah, okay. And I'm gonna, while you're just opening that up, I'm going to send one more back to Freeland because one
Okay.
thing people say is like, well, she can't help it if she's the descendant of a Nazi collaborator. But that's not the issue. It's not only that she's the descendant, but she's a proud descendant. She's proud of her grandfather. She tried to
Mm-hmm.
whitewash his crimes. But anyway, this link that I sent you, it's these Alberta researchers, and they just have so much information on her youth, as you were
Wow.
mentioning, on her time as a journalist, on her time in Ukraine, on her youth activities with like Ukrainian youth groups, which are not all of them, of course, are indoctrinating groups, but the ones she was working with are. So it's quite an interesting article.
Yeah. Yeah. It shows they link her all the way here to Adolf Hitler. Because that's who her grandfather was following orders from. But I mean, this is Canada's liberal hero. So here's the other article you sent. The
Yeah.
military situation in the Ukraine.
Yes, and in this second article, the one you have open now, he not only corroborates that Russia had this credible information that Ukraine is preparing to mount an attack, but he also notes again what is omitted from the corporate media, that from I think it was February 16th, Ukraine, and he's got a graph if you scroll down, Ukraine increased their attacks on the Donbass. So it was already increasing from what had been waged for the past 8 years. It was increasing prior to
Mm.
Russia's commencement of a military operation on February 24th.
Jeez.
And so bear in
Yeah.
mind, this guy, he's not an RT contributor. He's not a Sputnik contributor. He's a former Swiss intelligence officer. So I would argue he's among the more neutral of people you could find. Another person who might be interesting for you to speak with is Larry C. Johnson. He was
Okay.
former CIA and former State Department, and I spoke with him a month or so ago, and it was very interesting. His take on Russia's military operation, which is not that different from President Putin's take, and also just his revelations as somebody who used to work in these. Uh, what you would call it, agencies.
Mm-hmm.
And he openly said, in terms of media representation of facts, he openly said, back in that day, of course, there wasn't internet, so they planted stories in different means. Like they would hire someone to be a journalist, and they would draft the story or plant the story, or whatever. He said they were so good at planting stories in media that even editors who knew the CIA wanted to plant stories and these editors didn't want the CIA stories planted. He said even those papers or those publications, we still succeeded in planting stories in them. So, that's just like when people think, oh, well, Eva's a Russian propagandist, or not just me, but anybody reporting a narrative that doesn't jive with, CBC, NBC, New York Times, whatever, just keep in mind they are all literally reading from the same script.
Mm-hmm.
And I know, Franco, I know you've covered Syria as well. I know I'm pretty sure you've interviewed Vanessa Beeley at least once,
Mm-hmm.
if not more. And I know you're aware of the media lies on Syria, but I speak from a personal vantage point of having been many, many, many times to Syria since 2014, and just seeing firsthand how media would report something completely opposite from what I was seeing. Like I mentioned with the French media earlier, omitting key facts or just making stuff up that never happened. And so,
Yeah.
with Ukraine, and like we've seen, I haven't been able to keep up with all the propaganda that Ukraine has been putting out, but like there was this ghost of Kiev that was actually like supposed to be some Ukrainian heroic fighter pilot that was actually just based on a video game, like the footage that they were putting out. There's the Mariupol maternity hospital hoax that I mentioned earlier. There are many, many other false claims Ukraine has put out, including like that Russia is losing, that Russian troops are dying and starving. Oh, I'm sure some are dying for sure, but like this notion that they're dying en masse and starving. And in fact, only recently, some Ukrainian, I think, military official admitted that Ukraine is losing, I think it's 300 troops a day. And I think Zelensky had given a far lower number.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so anyway, there's a lot of misinformation put out there. So I know your viewers are not going to be falling for the mainstream crap, but in
Right.
case anyone has strayed onto your channel by chance, step back and wonder, think like, why are you seeing exactly the same story
Yeah.
reported in the media with no variation, really?
Yeah, no, I always tell the viewers too to please share this to family or friends who are still being indoctrinated by some of this these Western media narratives. This graph is interesting. How prior to the Russian, what the media says, the Russian invasion. This is February 2022, right? This massive increase
Yes.
since 2014, February 2014. So it was, if we go by this trend, it was only going to continue to increase.
Yeah.
And then now that Russia's in there, now that they're fighting with the Ukrainian soldiers, as you mentioned, Zelensky is losing a lot of soldiers. A lot of the soldiers there have spoken out. I was like, they're sending us to get massacred. Like there's
Yeah.
no winning this war. And there was a low ball. I presented an article that was on Moon of Alabama showing how Zelensky's numbers were really lowballing the actual number of people who are being killed, the soldiers who are being killed. And it's interesting also, you mentioned how the media is also talking about, oh, Russia's winning this war even though Ukraine is losing more people. And what was I going with that? Oh, and then they keep saying, oh, Russia's running out of stuff. Russia's running out of
Yeah.
bombs. Russia's running out of men. And they've been reporting that for months now. But that's not the reality of the situation.
No, I mean, if you watch, listen to, sorry, or read like good military annals like Andrei Martyanov, who's a Russian military and naval expert, or I'm pretty sure Scott Ritter's addressed this as well, but I can't think of an article to quote him from. But I'm fairly certain anyway. Most honest military analysts would point out, look, Russia is using a fraction of their capabilities, and I know I've also heard something like, at some point Ukraine had, in terms of numbers of troops, had Russia outnumbered, but still they're losing. Because Russia's tactics are very strategic, and like, I'm not a military analyst, so I'm not going to attempt to explain that much. But the one thing people have said is like, well, Russia withdrew from Kiev, but I think the counter argument to that is that, well, Russia did not intend to take Kiev. That wasn't part of, at least not the current military strategy, from what I can understand. The current military strategy was both to eradicate military capabilities in Ukraine and also to restore stability and peace to the Donbass, which it's still ongoing, and Donetsk is suffering quite a bit, and other areas are suffering quite a bit because the Ukrainians have had 8 years to entrench themselves and fortify themselves. So whereas they can't necessarily mount an offensive, they can still come out of their holes and launch a volley or whatever of Grad missiles and Uragan missiles, even larger ones than that, at civilian areas of Donetsk, and then run back underground. So it makes it, that's just my understanding of why it's taking longer for Russia to eradicate these positions and completely restore peace. But this notion that it was trying to take Kiev or other cities, I don't believe that's based in reality. And so, but that's one of the kind of lines that's put out to say, oh, Russia's losing this war.
So where do you see this war going?
I don't know, honestly. I can't really predict it. I know one thing I've heard is that Russia is now ready to take it more slowly. And I mean, Ukraine, as we've both mentioned, is losing huge numbers of troops, and more and more Ukrainian soldiers are getting fed up with being thrown into the slaughter without proper training or equipment or ammunition, etc. So, I mean, I suppose there is also a chance that the Ukrainian army might, I mean, I don't know if that's going to happen or not, but it seems like it's within the realm of possibility that the Ukrainian army at some point might say, like, no, we're not going to do this anymore. I don't know. I suppose that's one possibility. But Russia is not outgunned. So it's I think, is able to wait if it needs to. And all this talk about sending more weapons and money to Ukraine now, I would recommend Brian Bartlett. He used to write under the pen name Tony Cartalucci of Land Destroyer, but he has a channel now called The New Atlas, and he's former military, I think former Marine. I should know this by now, but he has a good understanding of weapons and this whole concept of like, yeah, we're going to train up troops in 2 months, and he would say like, whatever time frame they're giving, he would say something to the effect, that's going to have no impact. At most, they'll come away with basic training, but they won't know how to use these weapons that are being given. So back to your question, like I could see more money being and weapons being poured into this, and more Ukrainian soldiers dying, but I don't see them achieving a conquest of, recapturing what Russia and Donbass forces have captured. I see more civilians being killed here and more Ukrainian forces being killed.
All right, Eva, thank you for coming on. I just want to ask, what final message would you want to leave the audience with?
Oh gosh, that's a hard one. Right now, as I mentioned at the very beginning, Donetsk is being it's quiet at the moment, but yesterday was a really hard day for the people of Donetsk, and it's really painful. Not only to be aware of the fact that people are being mutilated and slaughtered here, and the Western media is misreporting it. But then, just as we saw in Syria, the same tactic of vilifying the very forces that are actually saving these people. So, you know, Russian forces are here at the request of the people that live here, the people of these republics, to help them restore stability and peace. And so, this incessant vilification of everything Russian is just it's really horrendous and disgusting because, for example, yesterday 2 days ago, I was in Mariupol and I saw how Russian sappers, deminers, are cleaning up the mines and the booby traps that Ukrainian forces left in civilian areas of this one particular area of Mariupol, which, by the way, was near Azovstal. And these are residential apartment buildings, and they leave booby traps so that when civilians come back, that they will be killed because they won't know if I step on this sheet of metal, there's a mine underneath, or if I walk through this doorway, there's a hand grenade rigged up to a string that's going to be detonated once you walk through the doorway. These are the kind of tactics that they're doing. So it's like they're portrayed in the media as defending the people of the cities they formerly occupied, but they're doing the opposite. So I would just, yeah, I would ask people to really just question if you are still following corporate media narratives. You don't have to believe me, but do look at a variety of sources, and you will start to see that what Western media has been saying is not based in reality or actual tangible evidence. And on the other hand, there's a lot of people here documenting Ukraine's war crimes, and it's really hard to deny them any longer.
Yeah, Eva Bartlett, again, thank you very much for coming on the show and informing us. And to everybody else, I know that you will keep informing yourself. Stay informed.